Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 681 All those refugees belong to me. Above the central army tent, the St. George's Cross flag and the red and white rose flag representing the Tudor royal family were torn down by Marin's men and replaced with the white rose flag of the York family symbolizing Edward. Then, there was a thunderous cheer around the central army tent. When Marin led a large group of people to control the British Central Army tent, the sky had begun to brighten. In summer, the sky brightens early, and it was already very bright at 5 o'clock in the morning. At this time, the British soldiers who had been frightened and running around before finally gradually calmed down. However, it was too late. The surviving British soldiers saw that the flags of the Central Army tent had been replaced, and naturally understood that the British army was finished. Under the shouts of, "Put down your weapons, surrender and don't kill," from Marin's men, many British soldiers obediently dropped their weapons, and under the driving and shouting of Marin's soldiers, they gathered together and squatted with their heads in their hands. Of course, there were also brave British soldiers. However, their heroism could not last more than 3 seconds. The musketeers and archers under Marin were not vegetarians. Seeing who was still resisting fiercely, gunshots rang out and arrows flew. After more than an hour of suppression, the entire camp gradually calmed down. And Sivag in the city, after seeing the battle outside the city, took advantage of daybreak to lead his troops out to join Marin's army. Before, Sivag heard the movement outside the city before dawn. It stands to reason that the army in the city should go out of the city to respond to the outside at this time. However, the 5th Legion in the city are all new recruits and have not received night combat training. In the case of low visibility, if they rashly leave the city, the new recruits are prone to nervous collapse. Therefore, Sivag led his troops out of the city after dawn to help clean up the battlefield. In fact, Marin had previously instructed that the new recruits of the 5th Legion should not leave the city before dawn. Because the 2 legions under his command were enough to defeat the British army, there was no need for the 5th Legion to come out. Moreover, if the 7,000 French troops in the city also rushed out, it would be even more difficult to coordinate. Sivag brought out 5,000 soldiers from the 5th Legion to help guard the prisoners and seized supplies. In this way, Marin and his soldiers could also take the opportunity to catch up on their sleep. After all, they didn't sleep in the middle of the night. Henry Percy was so scared that he peed at this time, hiding in the corner of the British Army's central tent, trembling. After Edward came over, he asked Marin, "What should we do with this guy?" The reason why Edward asked this was because Marin's future fiefdom was in Northumberland. If Henry Percy was alive, Marin's legal status would be challenged. Marin thought for a while and asked, "Does this guy have children?" Edward recalled for a while and replied, "According to my sister's information, this guy seems to have 2 sons, and the eldest son is also called Henry Percy. Moreover, his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, are all called Henry Percy. Same name for generations?" Marin was a little surprised. "Yes, his title is Henry Percy, the 5th Earl of Northumberland, also known as Henry Percy V. Starting from the 1st Earl of Northumberland, several generations of Earls of Northumberland were called Henry Percy, and the only difference was the generation number." Edward said with a smile, "I surrender." Marin could only bow down. This family is lazy enough, and the names are so simple and crude. Several generations use the same name. Will they die if they change the name? How do you deal with him? Edward handed the disposal of Henry Percy to Marin. After thinking about it, Marin said, "Take him first, take him to London together. It's useless for me to kill him now, he already has 2 sons. But, if he doesn't die, your earldom will be controversial." Edward didn't plan to let Henry VII go anyway, including Prince Henry. He was almost killed himself, so naturally he would not be willing to let his enemy go. Moreover, Edward also agreed with Henry VII's approach. If he killed all the rivals for the throne, wouldn't the throne be stable? Marin shook his head and said, "Let's keep him first, so that the nobles in London will surrender. When we take over London, there will be plenty of opportunities to kill him, including his 2 sons. Edward suddenly realized that Marin wanted to use Henry Percy to lure out his wife and children in London. When both father and son are here, they will be killed together, and everything will be over. If Henry Percy is killed now, when London is broken, Henry Percy's family may hide with his 2 sons. In this case, it will be difficult to find. Staying outside is definitely a disaster. After taking over London, what reason should we use to execute those enemies? Edward asked. He and Marin had already discussed it. After taking over England, kill those great nobles so that their land can be taken back by the royal family. But let most of the small and medium nobles go to maintain the rule. This is a typical case of catching the big and letting the small go, which can stabilize the situation in England as soon as possible. The crime of regicide is unforgivable, Marin said firmly. Most of the great nobles participated in the death of Richard III, so it is justified to use this as an excuse to kill them. But the Earl of Northumberland who participated in the rebellion was Henry Percy's father, the 4th Earl of Northumberland. His father is dead, and he didn't participate in the regicide's Battle of Bosworth. This. Marin thought for a while and said. The city must be in chaos after the city was broken. The great nobles who did not participate in the regicide, including this guy and his son, can be killed in the chaos, and then the blame is put on the French. Good idea. Edward nodded repeatedly. Putting the blame on the French is absolutely politically correct. Just when Edward and Marin were discussing things in the British Army's central tent, Sakara came in. He reported. Sir, there is a larger camp 3 kilometers south of the British camp, where there are more than 60,000 refugees, who Henry Percy intends to bring back to Northumberland. Marin jumped up from his seat. What did you say? 60,000 people. All refugees? This is more than 60,000 people. Marin naturally attaches great importance to it. After the looting of the Scottish army, Northumberland suffered a serious population loss, and now there are only tens of thousands of people. With more than 60,000 people, this northernmost county in England can definitely be well developed. So, Marin jumped up excitedly. Sakara looked at Edward and answered in German. Yes, Archduke, it is more than 60,000 refugees. Moreover, most of them are young and strong refugees, and there are no old, weak, women and children. It is said that when plundering the population in Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire, Henry Percy ordered that only young and strong men and women were needed to adapt to the development labor. God really helps me. Henry Percy's approach is a bargain for me. Marin said happily. Also, Grand Duke, there are 15,000 civilians on the south side of the British camp who help transport military rations and supplies. Needless to say, those refugees belong to me. Including those civilians, I want them all. Marin said with high spirits. Edward saw the two communicating in German and was a little dumbfounded at first. After Marin explained, Edward said reluctantly. There are 60,000 people, and there are 15,000 civilians. Grand Duke Marin, shouldn't you leave some for me? Edward felt a little distressed to give so many people to Marin. Marin said speechlessly. Your Majesty, you are about to become the King of the Kingdom of England. There are nearly 3 million people in England. I am only going to take 75,000 people, and you are reluctant to give them up. You know, there are millions of people in several counties in the southeast. Edward suddenly remembered that after he became king, and after solving those great nobles, it seemed that there was really no shortage of population. So, he took more than 60,000 refugees and 15,000 civilians and gave them all to Marin, and planned to send them to Newcastle first under the escort of Sivag's soldiers. Newcastle is now under Marin's control, controlled by 2,000 or 3,000 civilians, and a large amount of food is stored. It would be better to settle these people on the spot if they were sent there. As for the more than 10,000 captured British soldiers, Marin thought it was too dangerous, so they were temporarily tied up with ropes, guarded by soldiers, and taken south together. When the war is won, it will be up to Edward to decide whether to kill or keep. Chapter 682, Too Much Food Consumption. Edward did not give the 15,000 civilians to Marin after all. Because the army went south, it really needed civilians to help transport supplies. Moreover, these 15,000 civilians were basically recruited from several counties in the southeast. They all had families in the southeast counties. If they were taken to Northumberland alone, what would happen to their families? Without the pillar of the family would collapse. Marin originally wanted Edward to find their families and send them to Northumberland. But after thinking about it, the workload was too large and too complicated. Moreover, some old, weak, women and children may not be suitable for such a long journey. In the end, Marin gave up the 15,000 civilians who transported the baggage, and continued to send them to help transport supplies and go south with the army. And Marin was not very sorry for losing these 15,000 strong men. Because England will be his sooner or later, and these 15,000 civilians will be his people sooner or later. As for now, let's just give Edward face. Moreover, there are more than 60,000 young men and women, which is enough to develop Northumberland. When the army went south, it did not take the route that Henry Percy led to the north, but took Lincolnshire in the east. The reason for taking this route is that Lincolnshire is close to the sea, and it is more convenient to transport food and grass supplies. When crossing the Humber River at the junction of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Marin stopped on the south bank of the Humber River. The reason for stopping was that Marin was waiting for the mainland to transport food and grass. Now the size of Marin's army has reached a terrifying 30,000 people. In addition, there are 15,000 English civilians with the army, and more than 10,000 captured British soldiers. Add up, there are a total of 50,000 mouths. If Sivag, who escorted the refugees to the north, comes back, then the total population of this huge team will reach more than 60,000 people. This is not counting the horses that can eat more than people. With so many people and horses, the consumption of food is an astronomical figure. Most of the large amount of food seized from the British camp was given by Marin to the refugees who followed Sivag northward. They also needed food to survive to Northumberland. This wave of sending food to the people made Marin's reputation very strong. However, this also led to the shortage of food and grass for the army heading south. In desperation, Marin had to send someone to Newcastle to send a letter to transport another batch of food. With 50,000 mouths and horses, the daily food and grass consumption exceeded 100,000 pounds. Only a large household with a lot of food like Marin can afford it. If someone else comes, the food consumption alone can eat people down. Marin's food reserves are in the unit of 100 million pounds. Before, a lot of food was taken out to brew ergoto and even feed pigs. Before, because of the fear that the secret of high grain yield would be known to other countries, they naturally did not dare to sell it in large quantities. Now, on the British side, Marin is not worried. Britain is isolated overseas and does not know much about what is happening on the European continent. Although Marin brought a lot of food, the people in Britain didn't know that Marin's food was all produced in the country. Even Edward didn't know where Marin's food came from. In Edward's opinion, some of Marin's food must be self-produced. But there must be a lot of it purchased from other countries. After all, Marin's territory is not very large, and the food production must be just like that. Marin was originally a businessman, and he also participated in the exploration of the Indian route and the trade of spices. It is estimated that he spent a lot of money to buy a lot of food to supply this war. Even Edward himself and his 7,000 French troops and 3,000 German mercenaries relied on Marin's aid to eat. Otherwise, many of Edward's men would have starved to death at this time. Henry VII didn't even need to send troops, hunger could destroy his army. Marin paid so much, so it was very generous for Marin to ask for Northumberland and the Isle of Wight after the war. After all, Marin had spent too much food before. The food and grass of Edward's army were basically supported by Marin. With this calculation, Marin estimated that it would be difficult to recover the cost for many years. But he didn't know that Marin didn't care about the investment of this cost at all. In Marin's view, as long as England can be annexed in the end, no matter how big the investment is, it is worth it. England's locational advantage is too great. It controls the English Channel and is the biggest obstacle for Germany to the Atlantic Ocean. Having read so many novels about the Second and Third German Reichs in his previous life, and having read a lot of history, Marin knew that if the issue of control over the English Channel was not resolved, Germany's road to the ocean would be cut off at any time. Therefore, if Germany wants to become a colonial empire, it must either annex France or annex Britain. If it is the Second German Empire, France is naturally better to annex. Because Germany is a landlubber and has no ability to cross the sea to annex England. France borders Germany and is the best target for annexation. Of course, the difficulty of annexing France is very, very great under the intervention of other countries. However, that was the end of the 19th century. Now it is only the beginning of the 16th century, and the situation is completely different. The British had not yet experienced the Elizabethan era in the second half of the 16th century. The navy was not strong, and the army was even worse. Moreover, the population of England was less than 3 million, which was easier to manage. Unlike France, which had a population of 15 million at this time. Even if France was annexed, it would be difficult to control the 15 million French people. Not only that, France was also a for-war land. Its east was the territory of its enemy, the Habsburg family, its southwest was the territory of its traditional rival, Spain, and there were British pirates in the north. No matter how you look at it, it was much more difficult to control France than England in this era. And England's conditions were much better than France. First of all, in England itself, there was only one small country with low strength, Scotland in the north. That is, a small country like England with a weak army would have swallowed up the Kingdom of Scotland if it had been replaced by Marin's army. Even without Marin, England, whose army has always been relatively frustrated, can still steadily suppress Scotland. Therefore, England only has one big enemy left, France. As long as it guards against the French maritime attack on the south side of the English Channel, then England's national security will be fully guaranteed. In this comparison, Marin quickly made the most favorable choice, choosing to annex England. As long as England is annexed, it can not only control the English Channel, a waterway that is vital to Germany. Moreover, it can also be of great help to Marin's overseas colonization. After all, England is a traditional seafaring nation. With Britain, it is equivalent to having enough sailors, which is very conducive to colonial expansion. Just as Marin was thinking about it, a large amount of food was finally delivered to the warehouse at Newcastle Dock, and the food crisis of tens of thousands of people was fully addressed. Otherwise, before Marin sent out his troops, the food problem alone could toss the army to collapse. After getting the food, Marin decided to go south quickly. After all, there are more than 55,000 mouths to feed, and there are also those war horses. If we delay for one more day, we will consume more than 100,000 pounds of food and fodder. So, it is better to end this war as soon as possible. Chapter 683, Are the Scots going to take advantage of the situation? Marin reorganized his troops on the south bank of the Humber River, waiting for the return of Sivag's 5,000 troops escorting refugees, so that the whole army could go south. At that time, Marin will lead 35,000 troops, with thousands of wounded soldiers left in York, to the south, attack London directly, and destroy Henry VII's Tudor dynasty. However, plans cannot keep up with changes. Just as Marin was impatiently waiting for Sivag's 5,000 troops to return, Sivag suddenly sent someone to deliver an urgent report. The Kingdom of Scotland suddenly sent 10,000 troops south, and had occupied a large area of land in the north of Northumberland, and was about to hit Newcastle. Marin suddenly felt as uncomfortable as if he had eaten a fly. I have an MMP to say. However, this is not surprising. Although this time Marin, Edward and Louis XII planned to leave Scotland alone. However, King James IV of Scotland is not a fool. Before, James IV did not receive any intelligence, so he naturally did not get involved. However, things have been happening for so long, and Scotland and England are close together, so James IV has naturally received intelligence. When James IV learned that Edward and Louis XII had excluded him as an ally and went to Germany to find Marin as an ally, he was furious. What the hell? When they were in trouble, they thought of Scotland, and when they shared the benefits, there was no share for Scotland. So, King James IV of Scotland planned to take it himself. But the total population of the Kingdom of Scotland was only 500,000, and it took James IV a long time to gather 10,000 troops from all over the country. In addition, a large amount of supplies was prepared. Because James IV knew that he had looted several counties in northern England, and now he could not get food locally. It was not until the battle to defend York City started that James IV finally gathered troops and food. Then, he swore an oath in Edinburgh and marched south in a mighty manner. This time, James IV planned to take advantage of the civil unrest in England and tear off a large piece of meat from England. When Sivag sent more than 60,000 refugees gathered by Henry Percy to Northumberland, the Scottish army happened to enter the north of Northumberland. Seeing the urgent situation, Sivag immediately stopped his northward steps and settled the refugees on the south bank of the Tyne River, and no longer took them northward for resettlement. It happened to be July now, and it would not be cold to set up tents by the river. Then, Sivag urgently sent people, 1 person and 3 horses, to go south at all costs to ask Marin how to deal with the Scottish army. After reading Sivag's letter with a frown, Marin was also a little hesitant. So, he invited Edward to discuss countermeasures. Your Majesty, what do you think of the attitude of the Scots? Should we join them and go south to London, or block their way south? Edward also frowned, and after thinking for a long time, he replied. Grand Duke Marin, we did not invite the Scots to join us this time. I am afraid that James IV will be very resentful. Moreover, I did not intend to invite Scotland before because I was afraid that they would make territorial demands. After a pause, Edward continued. James IV is different from you. He is the King of Scotland and naturally has great ambitions. Although you want Northumberland, you are also an Earl of the Kingdom of England. But if James IV opens his mouth, then it would be considered that the Kingdom of England cedes territory to the Kingdom of Scotland. The nature of these two situations is completely different, so I don't want to invite James IV, and I agree with you to calculate the French. Because these two countries want the Kingdom of England to cede territory, and you are willing to become an Earl of England. After listening, Marin nodded repeatedly. Edward did not seem stupid. He knew that France and Scotland were both ambitious evil neighbors. However, he didn't know that he had been kicked as a bad guy by the French and could not have other descendants. If he knew this, he would definitely regard Marin as a bad guy. The reason why Edward tolerated Marin but not France and Scotland was because both France and Scotland had the intention to annex or weaken the Kingdom of England. Marin was different. He was just a German prince and there was no legal possibility of threatening his throne. Moreover, Marin's asking price was not high. He only had Northumberland and a very small Isle of Wight. Northumberland was a border county with a sparse population and was easily invaded by Scotland. Marin did not want the wealthy county on the southeast coast, but Northumberland. For Edward, it was too cost-effective. Moreover, after Marin became the master of Northumberland, he was naturally obliged to help guard the northern border. No matter how you looked at it, he was not a threat to Edward. As for the marriage contract with little Margaret, Marin was also the second in line. If Louis XII gave birth to a son, he would not have a share. So, it seems that Marin's requirements are very low, and his benefits are very small. He seems to be a good person. However, the premise of all this is that Edward does not know that Marin has drugged the Queen of France, and Louis XII is destined to not give birth to a prince. And Edward himself can't give birth to a son, so Marin is the final winner. Then, Your Majesty, how should I deal with the 10,000 Scottish troops? Marin asked. Then, can your 5,000 troops stop the 10,000 Scottish troops? Edward asked hesitantly. If you guard Newcastle City, there will be no problem. But if you want to stop the Scottish army from going south, it will be a bit difficult. Marin said honestly. The 5,000 people brought by Sivag are all recruits and lack experience in frontal combat. If you occupy Newcastle City and confront the enemy, you can still do it with the weaker combat effectiveness of the Scottish army. However, if the Scottish army bypasses Newcastle City and goes south, there is nothing you can do. After all, these recruits cannot fight the Scottish army in the wild. Or, you send another 5,000 troops back to assist. Edward asked. Marin shook his head and rejected it directly. Your Majesty, don't forget that the 7,000 French soldiers are now an unstable factor. My 20,000 troops have to monitor Henry VII's forces while attacking them. Therefore, it is necessary to maintain a scale of more than 20,000. Otherwise, if the French make trouble, we will all be finished. Edward thought about it, and the 7,000 French soldiers have now become one of the unstable factors. However, it is not necessary to kill those French soldiers. Because those people have been appeased. When attacking London, Edward and Marin both counted on the 7,000 French soldiers to lead the siege as cannon fodder. After all, the city of London is too tall and solid. If you want to capture London, cannon fodder soldiers are inevitable. These 7,000 French soldiers have solid military skills, and they are not their own people. It doesn't matter whether they live or die. They are the most ideal siege cannon fodder. Suddenly, Marin's heart moved. He remembered the more than 7,000 thieves of the Robin Hood thieves group who hid in the Pennines under his arrangement. The combat effectiveness of those thieves may not be as good as that of the regular army, but asking them to assist Sivag seems to be a good solution. Chapter 684, Using Thieves to Stop the Scots. Marin thought for a long time, but he didn't make up his mind. After all, he didn't trust the thieves' fighting spirit. To put it bluntly, the gang of Robin Hood thieves was a gang of robbers. Although under the training of Coster and Merrick, the combat effectiveness of these thieves is far superior to that of ordinary thieves. However, thieves are thieves after all, and Marin is afraid that they don't have enough fighting spirit to fight against the Scots. It just so happens that Coster and Merrick are now hiding in the mountains and forests of the Pennines upstream of the Ouse River, a tributary of the Humber River, with the Robin Hood thieves. And Marin's camp is on the south bank of the lower reaches of the Humber River. So Marin simply sent someone to call Coster and Merrick over and ask them what they think. Coster and Merrick received the call and quickly rushed to Marin's camp. Marin asked them about the combat effectiveness of those thieves, and the two were a little unconfident. Strictly speaking, after the training of Coster and Merrick, the basic military skills of those thieves are still relatively solid, no less than ordinary soldiers. But the key to the problem is that in the past 2 years, these thieves have been fighting guerrilla warfare and have never confronted the government troops head-on. Therefore, Coster and Merrick are not so sure about the fighting spirit of these thieves. After all, it is difficult to expect a group of thieves who are used to running away when they see the government troops to bravely confront the enemy head-on. However, when Marin said that he hoped that the more than 7,000 thieves would assist Sivag in blocking the Scottish army from moving south, Coster and Merrick's expressions suddenly changed. "Grand Duke, we think that those thieves can still be used against the Scottish army." After Coster said this, Merrick nodded repeatedly beside him. "Why is that?" Marin asked curiously. Coster said confidently. "Did the Grand Duke forget where those thieves came from? Of course, they are the English refugees from the northern counties." As soon as he finished speaking, Marin quickly reacted. "You mean, those thieves hate the Scottish army?" Coster nodded and said. "Yes, the reason why those people became thieves is because of the Scottish. They robbed all the food in the northern counties and even killed all the livestock. This caused the people in the northern counties to have no food to survive, and many people starved to death. In our thieves group, many members have experienced family members starving to death. So, everyone hates the Scottish army. They may not have the courage to fight other armies. But if they fight the Scottish army, they will be red-eyed." Marin was immediately ashamed. You know, the reason why the Scottish army went south was because he reported it. Moreover, the reason why the Scottish army robbed all the food in the northern counties of England was because Marin imitated Thomas Stanley's poisonous plan to suggest it. If those people in the Robin Hood thieves group knew that it was their idea to the Scottish army, wouldn't they tear themselves alive? Their families starved to death, and I must take a lot of responsibility. Marin felt cold all over, but he quickly reacted not to mention that the ordinary thieves of the Robin Hood thieves didn't know that he had come up with the idea, even King James IV of Scotland didn't know that it was his idea. James IV only knew that it was Edison, the owner of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, who gave him the idea, but he didn't know who Edison was. Only Edward and Princess Margaret knew their specific identities, and even the French didn't know that they were the so-called Edison. So, now those people in the Robin Hood thieves hate the Scottish army, not themselves, the mastermind behind the scenes. Thinking of this, Marin thought that those thieves who hated the Scottish army should fight to the death with the Scottish army. Although I feel sorry for them, Marin's heart has long been black as charcoal after being a ruler for so many years. If it were a kind ruler, he would not be able to achieve the current achievements, and he might not even live to this day. In Marin's eyes, those thieves of the Robin Hood thieves are just pawns. And he himself is the chess player. Will the chess player care about the feelings of the chess pieces? No. Therefore, Marin, with a thick face and a black heart, forced these poor English people into thieves, and then bewitched them to fight the Scots in the name of revenge. However, there must be a reason for these English thieves to fight the Scottish army, that is, a high-sounding reason. Otherwise, this so-called rebel army with unknown identity may not be accepted by both sides of the war. So Marin found Edward and hoped that he would recruit those thieves in the name of the King of England as patriotic forces to participate in the confrontation with the Scots. Hearing Marin's shameless request, Edward stared at Marin for a long time. He really couldn't imagine how Marin, who forced those poor English refugees into thieves, had the face to use them to fight the Scots. However, thinking that he was also a member of the conspiracy with Marin, Edward no longer despised Marin. Strictly speaking, Marin did this to help him regain the throne. Therefore, Edward himself was also responsible for the starvation of the families of the thieves. In the end, Edward signed a document in the name of the king, announcing the pardon of all the members of the Robin Hood thieves and allowing them to go to the Northumberland front in the name of a patriotic group to cooperate with General Sivag to resist the invasion of the Scottish army. If they make military achievements, they can be rewarded afterwards. Before Coster and Merrick went back, Marin specifically explained and taught them some tactics. Marin's plan was to select the 3,000 people who hated the Scots the most from the Robin Hood thieves and enter Newcastle to assist Sivag in defending the city. These people hated the Scottish army the most and were most suitable to fight desperately with the Scottish army on the top of the city. Their anger and hatred would cause great trouble to the Scottish army. And the remaining more than 4,000 thieves, under the leadership of Coster and Merrick, would take advantage of the low development and many forests in Northumberland to fight guerrilla warfare with the Scottish army. These people will be divided into two parts, and more than 3,000 infantrymen will attack the Scottish army's camp in batches and in turns. Even if the sneak attack fails, the Scots must not be able to sleep. This tactic was called tired enemy tactics in ancient China, which makes you nervous all night and sleep poorly. In this way, you will not have the energy to fight during the day. In this way, Newcastle's defense will be easier. If the tired enemy tactics are used too much and the opponent ignores it, it's okay. Marin specifically asked Coster and Merrick to bring back a batch of gunpowder barrels. When the opponent ignored his harassment in the middle of the night, he would run to the enemy camp in the middle of the night to light the gunpowder barrels. The huge explosion and vibration made it difficult not to wake up the enemy. There were only 900 horse thieves left, and Marin told Coster and Merrick to lead one of them to be responsible for the sneak attack on the Scottish Army's food transport team. When you see the enemy's food transport team, destroy it, take away some of the food if you can, and burn the rest. If there is no time, burn them all. The Scottish Army has 10,000 soldiers, and it is said that there are also several thousand civilian laborers. With so many people, the amount of food and grass needed must be huge. The mission of the 900 horse thieves is to sneak attack the Scottish Army's food transportation route. Even if the enemy protects the food and grass tightly and the sneak attack fails, the 900 horse thieves can easily run away. After all, the enemy guarding the food and grass will never dare to chase them out easily. Otherwise, it is easy to be successfully attacked by another possible enemy. Oh, no, the enemy has never seen this tactic, maybe we can try it. Let one group of horse thieves divert the enemy troops escorting the food and grass to chase, and then another group of horse thieves will sneak attack and burn the food and grass from another direction. When Marin finished explaining the tactics, Coster and Merrick were already looking at Marin with the eyes of God. It was too amazing. The Scottish army must have been tossed around by thousands of guerrilla bandits. Chapter 685 Food Safety Issues. As Marin guessed, when Coster and Merrick returned to the thieves' station and told them about going north to fight against the Scottish army, the thieves became excited. Most of them had a deep hatred for Scotland. Although the Scottish army did not directly massacre the residents of several counties in northern England, they robbed all the food, which was equivalent to killing many people in disguise. And these thieves are basically relatives of the victims. They had to join the thieves' group to survive. Who would be willing to do it if there was a way to survive? At the beginning, the Scots robbed all the food of the residents of several counties in the north, killed all the livestock, and made bacon to take away. In this way, the people in several counties in the north suddenly became refugees, so they flocked south, hoping to go south to ask for food. However, in order to prevent refugees from disrupting the most prosperous southeast region of England, Henry VII sent a large army to set up a defense line south of several counties in the middle to prevent refugees from going south. In desperation, these people had to become robbers in order to survive, coupled with Coster and Merrick's deception. Although they survived, they did not forget their hatred for the Scots. Now, when Coster and Merrick mentioned it, their unbearable memories suddenly emerged in their minds. Thinking of their parents, wives and children who starved to death at home, many thieves couldn't help crying. But soon, they hid their sadness and their faces became extremely ferocious. The Scots must pay with blood. Yes, kill them. We want revenge. Such a fanatical atmosphere suddenly filled the camp. Taking this opportunity, Coster and Merrick announced the formation of a volunteer army, selecting 3,000 people to enter Newcastle to assist in defense and confront the Scots head-on. As expected by Marin, many thieves whose families starved to death signed up enthusiastically. According to Marin, such people are eager for revenge and are most suitable to fight the Scottish army on the top of the city. Because of hatred, they will not take a step back. And those who are not very active in signing up, either their family members have not died, or they do not have the courage to fight. Such people on the top of the city may cause trouble. However, because they are not so fanatical, they are quite suitable for harassment warfare. Because these people will not fight the Scottish army as easily as those fanatical people. The most important thing about harassment warfare is to retreat after one strike. If you are eager for revenge, you will fight to the end, which will eventually lead to a direct confrontation. And this group of thieves, confronting the Scottish regular army head-on in the wild, is tantamount to sending themselves to death. So, as a liberal arts student who has studied psychology, Marin's judgment on this point is quite accurate. In the end, Coster and Merrick selected 3,300 thieves who were eager for revenge, led by Coster's confidant Lescott, to Newcastle to assist in the defense. Of the remaining approximately 4,200 people, Coster left 300 people to protect the thousands of family members who followed the army. The remaining 4,000 people were divided into two parts. The 900 horse thieves, led by Coster himself, attacked the food route of the Scottish army. And Merrick, with the remaining 3,000 people, was responsible for harassing the Scottish camp in batches in the middle of the night, so that the Scottish could not sleep well. After the division of labor, the three northward troops went north together, ready to deal with the Scottish. Especially the 3,300 thieves who were eager for revenge, they exuded murderous aura and wanted to fly to Newcastle immediately to fight the enemy to the death. At the same time, Marin also sent people north to inform Sivag to prepare to welcome these friendly forces and to deliver supplies to these thieves through the Tyne River. In the era of cold weapons, there was no need for any ammunition supply. The main supply was food and grass, and the replacement of broken swords. Of course, the supply of bows and arrows was also a big deal. Marin had long regarded Newcastle as his base camp in England, so he invested a lot of money to operate it. At this time, the city of Newcastle was full of food and could not be eaten. After all, this was prepared for the consumption of tens of thousands of troops. However, this also caused a problem, that is, Newcastle cannot be lost. If the Scots got the mountains of food in Newcastle, they might have the courage to continue to move south. You know, although the Kingdom of Scotland is large in area, most of the area is highland. In later generations, the Scottish Highlands were very famous. The so-called Scottish Highland Infantry in the British Army were actually the mountain people of Scotland. Because there were many highlands and only a little plain in the south, the population of Scotland could not be too large, because the arable land was not enough to feed too many people. Therefore, the Scots have always had the idea of going south to invade England. But unfortunately, because of the small number of people, in the era of cold weapons, Scotland's national strength has always been weaker than England in the south. I want to invade England, but I can't beat it. Only when England changes dramatically can Scotland go south to reap the benefits. No, I heard that Edward gathered tens of thousands of troops and fought Henry VII. James IV felt that the opportunity had come, so he immediately led the army south. However, the food and grass of the army going south became the weakness of the Scottish army. Why? As mentioned before, Scotland has more mountains and fewer plains, and there is not much arable land, so the food is not sufficient. Often the army goes south, and it takes a long time or even 2 or 3 years in advance to prepare the food and grass needed by the army. Of course, this is not necessarily the case. The Scots can also obtain enough food and grass by plundering the English and supplying them on the spot. As for the life and death of the English whose food was robbed, what does it have to do with them? But the problem is that the Scottish army had just plundered several counties in northern England the year before last, completely destroying the agricultural production in northern England. Until now, the agriculture in several counties in northern England has not recovered. Therefore, if you go south at this time, you can't expect to grab the food needed by the army, and you can only rely on domestic transportation. However, if you take down Newcastle, where Marin reserves food, that's another story. Newcastle's food reserves are about 50 million pounds. According to the ordinary standard of £1 per person per day, it is enough for 100,000 people to eat for 16 months. The most important consumption of the army these days is food. If the Scottish army grabs so much food, then there will be no worries about supplies. Then, the Scottish army can toss around in northern England as much as they want, because they can afford it. Fortunately, Marin asked Sivag to lead his army north to escort the refugees. If the Scots accidentally took the 50 million pounds of food stored in Newcastle because of the lack of troops, Marin would definitely cry in the toilet. Because this not only funded the Scottish army, but also cut off Marin's food supply. You know, he has tens of thousands of people in his hands, and they all rely on Newcastle to ship food over. Otherwise, why did Marin choose the seaside route? No, it's convenient for food transportation. However, now that Newcastle is facing a war, it is difficult to transport food safely to the south. Fortunately, the Humber River basin is now under Marin's control. So, for the safety of the food route, Marin personally wrote a letter ordering Newcastle's ships to go south and arrive at Grimsby, a port town on the south bank of the Humber estuary. Moreover, Marin plans to mobilize 1,000 troops from the mainland to guard the small port of Grimsby. After that, this will become the rear base for the supply of food and grass for Marin's army. Newcastle's food and grass will definitely not be transported because of the war. However, as long as this small port is guarded, Marin can send ships back to Emden to transport food. In this way, the army's food and grass supply is solved. You ask, why not move the grain transport port south? There are English ships cruising in the south. Marin used Danish pirates to pin down England's maritime power in the waters of Suffolk and Norfolk, making British ships temporarily unable to cruise north. Otherwise, this small port north of Lincolnshire is not suitable as a food logistics base. However, Marin did not dare to guarantee whether the English ships would go crazy and ignore the pirate harassment and just go north to the mouth of the Humber. Therefore, for safety, Marin decided to send 10 500-ton main battleships from the mainland to protect the safety of Grimsby port. At the same time, let the 250 level armed merchant ship take on the task of transporting grain. The 250 level armed merchant ship also has the ability to fire, and is not afraid of being intercepted by the English Navy's cog ship. In this way, the supply of food and grass for the army is completely safe. At this time, it is time to show the dagger, and Marin does not need to hide it anymore. So, his warships can also be shown. If they were to continue to hide their intentions and accidentally cut off the supply to the English Navy, Marin's army would starve to death. After all, there were 50,000 or 60,000 mouths to feed. Chapter 686 show off the invincible battleship. In fact, Marin had concealed his strength before in order not to scare Henry VII. Only if Henry VII was not frightened by Marin's army, he would have the courage to fight the French. Otherwise, knowing that there were 20,000 or 30,000 troops of Marin in the north, Henry VII probably had no courage to fight the French. It was precisely because Marin hid his strength that Henry VII had enough self-confidence to calculate the French according to the intelligence provided by Marin and completely destroyed the French navy. When the birds are gone, the good bows are hidden. When the cunning rabbits die, the running dogs are cooked. Will this arouse the disgust of dog lovers? Ancient people seem to love to eat dog meat. Now that the French fleet no longer exists, Marin doesn't care whether to destroy the English ships or not. Therefore, Marin decided to pull out his hidden main battleships and 250 level armed merchant ships to protect the food logistics base. If the English ships do not come, it will be fine. If they dare to come, they will all be sunk. Anyway, the cunning rabbits, French navy, are dead, and it doesn't matter whether these running dogs, English ships, stay or not. When Edward heard that Marin only sent 10 warships to protect the grain transport port of Grimsby, he couldn't help but said, "Grand Duke Marin, aren't 10 warships too few? Henry has more than 100 large warships. Can your 10 warships stop them?" Marin laughed and said, "Your Majesty, you have not seen my warships. Each one is 500 tons. Damn, Marin suddenly remembered that Edward didn't know what tons meant. After a pause, Marin changed his statement. "That is to say, one of my warships is more than twice as large as an ordinary English warship." Well, England's warships are generally more than 200 tons, there is no way, the mainstream in Europe is at this level now, and de Gama's flagship when he was looking for India a few years ago was only more than 100 tons, Marin had to compare it this way so that Edward could have an intuitive understanding. But, being twice as big is useless. 10 ships are equivalent to 20 ships on the other side. Edward said after thinking about it. Marin was speechless. This kid learned elementary school math well, but is this how ships are compared? Moreover, his elementary school math made Marin unable to find a reason to refute for a while, so he had to be depressed. Suddenly, Marin had a second-year illness and decided to prove it to Edward. So, the army camp was temporarily moved to Grimsby Port. On the one hand, Marin commanded his soldiers to build a temporary long bridge wharf to facilitate the ships from Newcastle and the warships from the mainland to dock. On the other hand, it also let Edward see how awesome his warships were. Of course, Marin was not really having a second-year illness. In fact, he also meant to show off his military power. Edward had already exposed his idea of wanting to eat alone. Marin was afraid that Edward could not see the situation clearly and thought that the English navy was invincible. In this way, Edward might refuse the fiefdom and title that he had promised to give to Marin. Therefore, taking this opportunity, Marin decided to show Edward, a country bumpkin, the invincible battleships of the powerful Grand Duchy of the North Sea. Only by scaring this country bumpkin, he dared not renege on the fiefdom and title promised to him, or even the marriage between little Caesar and Princess Margaret. Edward was also a little amused and sad about Marin's sudden childish behavior of, "I must show you my best toy." However, now that the main force of the British army has been eliminated, Henry VII can't find any other army at all. Therefore, Edward is not in a hurry to go south. It's just right, by the way, I can appreciate the so-called Niobe battleship that Marin boasted about the world. To be honest, Edward really has the idea of, the fleet of the Kingdom of Britain is invincible in the world. Although I haven't thought about reneging on Marin's reward, I am indeed a little self-inflated. If Henry VII is eliminated, and then the titles and interests are used to win over all the big ship owners, Edward will really have the idea of, I am the only one on the sea. Moreover, Edward is not worried about not being able to win over those big ship owners. Because, as long as he defeated and killed Henry VII on land, he could control their home port. These ships had to dock at the port after all. If they didn't surrender to him, would they go to sea to be pirates? Therefore, Edward had no doubt that he would become the king of a maritime power. It was during the usual conversation that Marin saw Edward's inflated idea, so he decided to show his super battleship temporarily. A 500-ton battleship would not even be AP after a few decades. Because the main force decades later was a 1,000-ton battleship. However, at this time in the early 16th century, it was definitely a behemoth-level existence. Moreover, because the ship was full of artillery, it was absolutely shocking when it was fired in salvo. A week later, the 500-ton battleship formation of Marin and others finally arrived. And Marin's army also built more than a dozen temporary long-bridge docks in Grimsby for these ships to berth. Then, Marin, with a smug look, pulled Edward, who was already stunned, and boarded the battleship for a visit. I have never seen such a majestic battleship. Before boarding the deck, Edward was shocked by the huge and majestic appearance of these battleships. In fact, it was Marin himself who was shocked by the huge Constitution aircraft model given by his classmates on his birthday, and then he became fascinated with sailing battleships. And these battleships were basically designed and manufactured by Marin's craftsmen according to his memory. Although the tonnage is 4 times smaller than that of the Constitution, overall, there is still a shadow of the Constitution. Looking at Edward's shocked expression, Marin was secretly happy. And what shocked Edward even more was still to come. Before boarding the deck, Edward did not see the 40 heavy guns on the ship. Because it is not in combat mode now, the window of the lower gun deck is not open. The upper cannons were covered with canvas to protect them from wind and rain. After Marin boarded the deck, he ordered the crew to uncover the canvas and open the gun ports on the lower deck. This. Edward was so surprised that he couldn't speak. Of course he knew about the cannons. In the 100 Years' War between England and France, the British army was defeated by the French cannons. Originally, Edward thought that the French were very rich for investing hundreds of cannons in the First World War. But he didn't expect that there were 40 cannons on Marin's warship. If there were 10 ships, wouldn't that be 400 cannons? This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the size of these cannons is much larger than the bronze cannons Edward saw in France. Moreover, they are all golden copper cannons. How much copper material is needed to cast the cannons? Edward was stunned. In fact, the so-called copper cannons he saw were all fake. These cannons are actually cast from medium and low carbon steel with inaccurate carbon content control. Moreover, it was an old English blacksmith named Old John from Sussex who helped Marin to cast it. However, Marin did not want people to know that he had mastered the technology of casting large iron cannons. Therefore, Before showing it to the people of Hamburg and Lübeck, Marin thought of brushing a layer of gold paint on the surface of the iron cannon to pretend to be a bronze cannon. The so-called gold paint is tin sulfide. Tin sulfide looks very similar to the color of gold. And those liars or people who pretend to be rich like to use tin sulfide, a gold powder, as paint to make certain buildings or utensils shine with gold. The production of tin sulfide is also very simple. Just find an alchemist, buy some tin from the UK, and some sulfur from Italy. After a little tinkering, the gold powder came out. Marin had the gold powder paint darkened a little and painted on the steel cannon, so it looked like a bronze cannon. Moreover, when the guests were shown around, the muzzles were blocked, so that no one could see the iron inside the muzzles. In this way, if others wanted to engage in a naval arms race with Marin, they would say, "Okay, if you have money, cast a few bronze heavy cannons for me to see." The price of copper is so high, and casting a ship of 18-pound cannons would make ordinary princes go bankrupt. How could they engage in an arms race with Marin? Therefore, this layer of gold paint was to mislead others. Others were unaware that they used tons of copper to cast cannons, while Marin used steel to cast cannons. The cost difference was huge. If all the cannons used in several warships were made of copper, most European countries would go bankrupt. Edward, the country bumpkin, was really scared. Seeing so many heavy copper cannons weighing 2,000 or 3,000 pounds, more than 1 ton, he could only show his admiration on his face. What made him even more convinced was that Marin took him out to sea to test the cannons, in order to scare him. When 20 heavy cannons roared and fired 18-pound iron ball shells, the entire hull was shaking. If it weren't for Marin's support, Edward almost fell on the deck. The firepower is too strong. Edward could already imagine the terrible scene of those thin-skinned English merchant ships being smashed on the side by shells when facing these warships. Seeing that Edward was really scared, Marin nodded with satisfaction. Since the goal has been achieved, there is no need to continue the bombardment. After all, gunpowder and shells also cost money. Marin waved his hand, and the battleship returned to the dock. Chapter 687, Threatening and Winning Over Sailors. After landing, Edward became silent. He was now in a complicated mood, because he had to re-evaluate Marin as his partner. Before, Edward's impression of Marin was just that he was a capable land soldier. Although powerful, he was nothing in front of England's invincible fleet. Edward even had the intention of defaulting on his debt. However, what he saw and heard today completely overturned Edward's previous cognition. Just think about it, how terrible it would be for a lord with a strong army and navy. "Why do you want to help me?" Edward suddenly said this. As soon as he said it, Edward regretted it. However, he still looked at Marin nervously, hoping to get an answer. After being a noble for several years, Edward was no longer the little wight who had just been rescued from the Tower of London. He understood that there was no hatred or love without reason in this world. So, he really wanted to know what Marin really thought. Seeing Edward's heavy face, Marin knew that he was overthinking. However, Edward was crucial to his layout. Therefore, Marin decided to find a very suitable reason to get rid of Edward. So, after thinking for a while, Marin raised his head and answered solemnly. "The first is for the safety of navigation in the English Channel. You know, I have a fleet going to India for trade. And England, to put it bluntly, is a country with a pirate tradition. England controlled by the Tudor family has nothing in common with me, and I am afraid that they will covet my merchant fleet. Therefore, I would rather rescue you and restore the York dynasty. In this way, I will get an Isle of Wight and station a fleet there to ensure the safety of my fleet. In addition, I became the Earl of England, which can also deter those English pirate ship owners. As long as they dare to rob my ship, I can send troops to attack his hometown." Edward thought about it, and partially agreed with Marin's words, but still asked in confusion. "If you value the safety of the English Channel, you should have a county along the coast of the English Channel, not Northumberland, the northernmost county in England." "I originally thought so, but the coal mines in Newcastle attracted me. You know, East Frisia and West Frisia are located on the coast of Germany, but there are not many forests. Many of them are swamps and lack firewood fuel. Therefore, I need the coal in Newcastle. So, I chose Northumberland. But I don't want to give up the safety of the English Channel, so I also want the Isle of Wight as a fleet base. Marin said half-truthfully, but his expression was very sincere. Edward thought about it, and it seemed that what Marin said made sense. Then what's the matter with your son marrying Margaret? Now that the matter was open, Edward simply asked for clarification. Marin thought for a moment and said, "That's right, your majesty, you know, I'm of humble origin, and my father is just a poor knight in the countryside. Therefore, in Germany, those traditional princes actually look down on me. Before, I defeated the electorate of Saxony in the electorate of Brandenburg, but I didn't get much compensation, because those old nobles looked down on me and united to restrict me. In this case, there must be very few nobles willing to marry our Hoffman family. I'm very worried that my son Caesar will not be able to marry a princess of a princely state of equal status in the future. It just so happens that, taking this opportunity, if my son Caesar can marry a princess of the powerful Kingdom of England, I think our entire Hoffman family will be deeply honored." Marin said seriously. Although this is a bit of a bluff, the last sentence is true. If Caesar marries Princess Margaret, the other members of the Hoffman family will definitely be deeply honored. But your son's order is behind the son of His Majesty Louis XII. His Majesty Louis XII is old and may not be able to give birth to a son. Moreover, Queen Anne has a poor physique and her children always die. Marin laughed. Moreover, with the fat brother staying in the Paris palace, Louis XII should give up the idea of having a son. Edward nodded. Although he didn't dare to believe Marin completely, the explanation given by Marin was really reasonable, so reasonable that he couldn't find any point to refute. Looking at the lively scene of people coming and going on the dock and listening to the conversations of the sailors around him, Edward suddenly asked, "Why do all your sailors speak English?" Edward was actually talking about those Frisian sailors. The language they speak is very similar to English, like an English dialect. "No, your majesty, they speak Frisian." Obviously, Edward has not read the book Study on the Origin of European Nationalities, edited by himself and Leonardo da Vinci. But this is no wonder. Edward has been busy fighting with Henry VII in recent years. How can he have the time to read miscellaneous books? Moreover, he was in Ireland before, and the information was not smooth. Edward was stunned for a moment, so Marin introduced the relationship between the English and the Frisians in detail, which frightened Edward. Of course, Marin was not bluffing Edward, but really. No wonder we English and Scots never get along, it turns out that we are Germans, and they are Celts. Yes, the English are the descendants of Germans who migrated from the northwest coast of Germany and the western coast of Denmark. Of course, they are different from the Celts in Scotland. The Gauls and Scots in France are Celts, so it is normal for them to be close. Marin said nonsense casually. "You have so many sailors. Are they all Frisians?" Edward said casually while looking at the Frisian sailors gathered on the dock. "Well, I recruited them from the Frisians on the coast of Germany." Wait. Marin's face suddenly changed, and he remembered an important question. "What's wrong?" Edward asked curiously. "Your Majesty, we may have overlooked a very important issue." Marin smiled bitterly. "What's the problem?" "The sailors in England are also capable of fighting." "You mean?" Edward vaguely thought of something, but he had no idea for a while. "Although the main force of Henry VII's army was destroyed by us, I am worried that Henry VII will recruit those sailors to help defend London. I heard that there are many English sailors, estimated to be tens of thousands. Among them, there should be more than 10,000 who can fight. If these people are recruited by Henry VII to defend the city, they are also very powerful." Marin explained with a wry smile. He almost forgot that sailors can also go ashore to defend the city. Although they can't beat regular infantry in the wild, they are at least much stronger than militia in defending the city. You know, these people are all masters of swordsmanship and have strong personalities. With the cover of the tall city walls, their combat effectiveness is not bad. Edward understood after thinking for a while, and his face suddenly looked bad. If Henry VII really recruited tens of thousands of sailors to help defend London, it would really become difficult to siege the city. Then, what should we do? Edward is not good at strategy, so he can only ask Marin for help. Marin walked back and forth and thought for a while, then said, "I remember the intelligence said that Henry VII moved the main fleet to the Irish Sea to prevent you from escaping back to the island of Ireland. There is such intelligence. It was mentioned in the letter my sister sent me." Edward nodded. King Henry VII should know about Henry Percy's defeat by now, so he is very likely to send people to gather those sailors back to London to help. What should we do? Edward was a little worried. How about this, Your Majesty, you send someone to quietly post a notice at the dock of the Cinque Ports. What notice? Why post it at the Cinque Ports? Edward was puzzled. Your Majesty, the most powerful sailors in the English Navy basically come from the 5 ports of the 5 Ports Alliance. The homes of those sailors are basically near the docks of the 5 ports, and this notice is a threatening notice. Threat? What do you mean? Marin suddenly put on a vicious expression and said. Threat the families of those sailors. You can announce in the notice that anyone who helps Henry VII, the regicide and the false king, to defend London, we will send a large army to arrest their families in the 5 ports and publicly execute them outside the city of London. What? Edward jumped up in shock. This is the behavior of a tyrant. Nothing, just to prevent those sailors from really going to London to help Henry VII defend the city. Moreover, helping the regicide is equivalent to the crime of regicide. Is it too much to execute the family? Marin said lightly. Edward wanted to refute, but he felt that what Marin said made sense. In fact, what Marin said and did was common in ancient China. There are 9 or 10 clans implicated, so what is killing family members? Even in Europe, it is very common. But due to the spirit of chivalry, everyone just did it without saying anything. It was indeed not nice to post a notice like Marin did. However, Edward had to admit that this trick was pretty good. For the safety of their families, those sailors must be afraid and find it difficult to make up their minds to follow Henry VII. Even if there are those who are willing to follow Henry VII, they will have to bring their families to London for refuge. Otherwise, their families will not be able to escape death. Of course, we don't use this method all the time. We can also win over those ship owners and sailors, mainly ship owners. Because they have a great influence on sailors. Sailors rely on ship owners for their meals. If they offend ship owners, they will lose their jobs. Therefore, ship owners have a lot of say. But I don't know those ship owners. Edward said embarrassedly. He also knew the importance of those ship owners. In the future, he still hopes that those ship owners will cooperate with him to protect the safety of the English Channel. But he doesn't know them. I'll take care of this. Marin said confidently. Before, he had sent people to hire ships from the 5 Ports Alliance, so he naturally knew where those ship owners lived. Moreover, even now, Marin has left spies from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in 5 important ports. Those ship owners will definitely not participate in the war, but live in mansions in 5 ports. But those sailors have to come back to guard London, and the ships must return to the port first. Marin decided to persuade those ship owners to persuade those sailors to remain neutral. The specific approach is to send spies to throw packages into the yards of those ship owners late at night. There was a letter of persuasion to surrender in the package, as well as a dagger and a bag of coins. The meaning is very simple: those who follow me will prosper, and those who go against me will die. Choosing to die with the whole family or making a fortune quietly depends on a thought. I believe that those ship owners, as long as they are not too deeply involved with Henry VII, know that waiting and watching is the best choice at this time. At the same time, they also have enough prestige to persuade those sailors not to stand in line easily. Their words are quite useful to the sailors. Chapter 688. Are the French going to escape? In fact, Marin was totally overthinking. How many of those ship owners of the 5 Ports Alliance were fools? Responding to the court against the French was a national hatred, so they naturally participated actively. However, the fight for the throne between Edward and Henry VII was an internal conflict. Any smart ship owner would not have time to hide, so how could he easily get involved? Of course, there are also a small number of ship owners who are willing to gamble for the top position. For example, the Wallace family, in order to obtain a noble status, they fought hard. However, that is too dangerous. If they fail, the whole family will suffer. For example, when Henry VII seized the throne, the ship owners who stood on the wrong side, although not necessarily the whole family died, but the decline of the whole family was certain. Henry VII was not a good person, and he was also quite ruthless. However, if they were neutral, neither side would be embarrassed. Why? Because in order to guard against the French, no matter who came to power, they needed the support of these ship owners, especially the ship owners of the Five Ports Alliance. Therefore, there must be ship owners who will help Henry VII for wealth, and there will be those who will surrender to Edward in advance. But more people choose to wait and see. But there is a difference between waiting and watching. Waiting and watching by yourself and persuading the sailors to be neutral are completely different concepts. In order to keep the elite sailors of the Five Ports Alliance, who have the strongest combat effectiveness, neutral, Marin suggested to Edward that he should give very generous conditions helping to persuade the sailors to be neutral, tax exemption for 5 years. Those who perform well will be knighted. Tax exemption for 5 years, this is a very generous condition. In this era, the king's taxes are mainly collected from merchants. The tariffs on import and export trade operated by ship owners are the biggest part of it. Therefore, tax exemption for 5 years is definitely a very generous condition. Moreover, Edward's request is only to persuade the sailors he hired to remain neutral in this battle for the throne, which costs almost nothing. Edward was not very happy with this high price, but Marin comforted him and said, "Kill Henry VII and those nobles, their property and fiefdoms are all yours, are you short of money?" Edward thought about it, and those nobles were all very rich. Killing them in the name of regicide and confiscating their property would definitely make a fortune. Then, Edward agreed. This was easy to do, because Marin had already laid out England, and there were spies from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in the 5 major ports of the Five Ports Alliance. After a few years, he had already known the situation of the 5 major ports. The spies of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in the 5 major ports knew very well which ship owners had a good relationship with which famous and powerful sailors. As long as the ship owners who had a great influence on the powerful sailors with strong combat effectiveness were brought over, those powerful sailors could be deeply influenced. The so-called powerful sailors were actually those sailors who often played pirates and served the King of England during the war. These people were old hands who made a living on the sea, bloodthirsty and warlike, with strong fighting ability, and were the main force of the English naval battle. As long as they were appeased, Henry VII could only recruit ordinary sailors. And ordinary sailors, like militiamen, were much easier to deal with. Moreover, Edward's attempt to win over those ship owners and powerful sailors was also intended for the future. Because Edward still hoped to rely on them to stabilize the coastal defense in the future. However, just when Marin and Edward were busy winning over and threatening those ship owners and sailors, the French did something weird again. The French envoys came to the camp again. This time, they were going to take away all the French soldiers. The last time the French envoys came to Edward's army to incite the French army to make trouble, Marin used the method of borrowing your head for a while to resolve it, and also blew up the real spy. In the face of iron evidence, the French envoys had nothing to say, so they had to go back, almost making Louis XII angry to death. After Louis XII woke up again, he planned how to retaliate against Edward. But at this time, news came from Scotland. King James IV of Scotland led an army of 10,000 to the south. Louis XII suddenly became energetic, and he felt an opportunity in it. Of course, the French now have no chance. Because the French navy was completely destroyed, and several thousand infantry and a large amount of property were lost. So, the French have now lost the opportunity to participate in the struggle for hegemony in England. However, Louis XII was unwilling to let the 7,000 French troops continue to serve Edward. He was afraid that Edward would use these 7,000 French troops as cannon fodder to attack the solid city of London. In fact, Edward and Marin did plan so. So, Louis XII finally thought of a trick. "I won't get involved in your struggle for hegemony, is that not okay?" So, he sent an envoy and decided to bring all 7,000 French troops back to France. "What, you said the French have no ships? This is not a problem. Louis XII has already sent people to the Netherlands to hire merchant ships. Worried that the English will intercept the fleet? No, Henry VII will probably wake up with a smile when he hears that the French army is going to withdraw. How can he object? As for whether Edward will object to releasing people, this is also no problem, because Louis XII has already found an excuse. France is in civil strife, and this army needs to return to the country to serve the king, waiting online, very urgent. Edward is not in France, how can he know whether there is civil strife in France? Anyway, find an excuse to trick the 7,000 French troops back first. Even if Edward wanted to force them to stay, the French soldiers would not buy it. After all, they are all French. If they are forced to stay, they will be disunited and their hearts will not be here. They will not fight hard, so it is better to let them go. As for why Louis XII took these 7,000 French troops. In addition to stopping losses, that is, fearing that Edward would use up these people, he also wanted to muddy the waters in England. The British army was defeated. If it was a one-on-one fight, Henry VII would definitely not be Edward's opponent. However, it would be different if the Scots joined in. With the Scots behind him, Edward would not be able to attack Henry VII with all his strength, and he had to be careful behind him. According to Louis XII, Edward's army mainly consisted of 7,000 French troops, 3,000 German mercenaries and 20,000 people from Marin. If the 7,000 French troops retreated, Edward would only have more than 20,000 people left. But at the same time, Henry VII still had more than 10,000 sailors who could fight. And in the north, there are also 10,000 Scottish troops who have grievances against Edward. In this case, the three parties will form a delicate balance, which will completely muddy the waters of England. In this way, Edward's hands and feet will be bound and he will not be able to exert himself. If these 7,000 French troops were there, Edward might have more capital. But if the 7,000 French troops left, Edward's military strength would be stretched to the limit. To deal with two major forces at the same time, more than 20,000 people are not too many. In this way, England might explode. When the French envoy led the Dutch fleet around the North Sea and found the port of Grimsby to pick up the 7,000 French troops, Edward and Marin were a little confused. The other party said that there was a rebellion in the country, and you still couldn't let those French troops go. So, Edward was immediately depressed. Chapter 689, The Disguised Cession of Calais. After learning that Henry VII might summon sailors to help defend the city of London, Edward hoped to bring more soldiers to attack London to ensure success. However, Marin didn't care much. Why? Because there are many spies of his North Sea Chamber of Commerce in the city of London. With these people, the city gate can be opened. However, these are all Marin's backup. After all, it took Marin several years to plant these spies in the city of London. If you participate in the battle to capture the city, you will definitely be exposed. Once exposed, you will definitely be monitored by Edward in the future. During the years of Edward's rule, it was difficult for Marin to intervene in London's affairs. Therefore, Marin did not want to use this killer unless it was absolutely necessary. Moreover, Marin also asked the spies of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce branch in London to summon a group of dead soldiers to seize the city gate, bought a courtyard near the city gate, and dug an underground secret room for hiding soldiers. However, there are only more than 20 dead soldiers recruited, which is not enough to seize the city gate. Fortunately, Princess Margaret, as a local snake, prepared hundreds of people to help seize the city gate. Marin's plan is to let Princess Margaret's people live in the basement of the courtyard prepared by the North Sea Chamber of Commerce spies. When the siege starts, the two sides will gather together to seize the gate. But before that, Marin will let his men inform Henry VII so that Henry VII can kill Princess Margaret. However, this time must be grasped well, and it is best not to affect the death of the dead soldiers to seize the city gate. So, Marin actually doesn't care whether these 7,000 French soldiers leave or not. However, he can't tell Edward about these plans. Otherwise, Edward knows that he wants to murder his own sister and kill himself, although he may not necessarily implement it. Frankly speaking, Edward really wants to silence this French envoy. However, this guy came with a lot of fanfare and brought many Dutch merchant ships, and those French soldiers knew about it. At this moment, I can't cover it up if I want to silence him. When I heard that there was trouble in the country, the French soldiers suddenly became agitated. Even the knight François, who had been promised by Edward before, showed his intention to return to the country to serve the king. Knight François, have you thought about it? Once you go back now, the title of Earl will be gone. Faced with such temptation, François' face kept changing. After struggling for a long time, he still said dejectedly, "Your Majesty, I also want to stay and help you. But my comrades have all left, and it's useless for me to stay alone." Edward thought about it and it was true, everyone else has left, leaving only Knight François, what's the use? In the end, Edward could only accept the reality of letting 7,000 French soldiers go. But before leaving, the French envoy suddenly came to ask for compensation. After all, the French helped Edward so much, and they used 7,000 regular troops to help for so long, and it was reasonable to ask for compensation. Edward felt very difficult, so he asked Marin to help find a solution. The French meant very clearly, they wanted land. However, Edward could not cede land to the French casually. Not to mention that ceding the land of the homeland would endanger the national security of England. Even if he ceded non-native land, he would be regarded as a traitorous king by the people. If he could not convince the people, there might be acts of resistance in the future. Moreover, Edward really did not want to cede land to the French. Especially now that the French had lost their navy, Edward was not very afraid of France. After thinking about it, Marin smiled and said, "Your Majesty is unwilling to publicly cede land to France? That's easy. Didn't you promise to make Knight Francois a count before?" "Yes, but what does this have to do with paying the French?" Edward was puzzled. Since the French have occupied Calais, why not confer the title of Count of Calais on Knight Francois? "What do you mean?" "Since we have already lost Calais, then you can confer the Calais region to the French Knight Francois in the name of conferring the title. Moreover, grant the county of Calais the right to autonomy. In this way, if Calais is willing to be ruled by France, we can no longer control it." "You mean, ceding Calais in disguise?" "Yes. Anyway, Calais has been occupied by the French, and it is difficult for us to take it back. In that case, it is better to confer the title to Knight Francois in name. In this way, on the surface, Calais still belongs to England, and you have not lost your territory. As for the reality, who cares?" Edward's eyes suddenly lit up. This is good, this is good. Although Calais was actually lost, in this way, England can pretend that Calais is still England's on the surface. Edward likes this way of covering one's ears and stealing the bell, it is finally a fig leaf. I guess the Channel Islands can't be defended, they are too close to France. Edward sighed. The Channel Islands are only over 100 square kilometers, but they are so close to the French coast that the French can row a small boat to them. If the French really want to rob them, they can do it even without a navy. Even if Edward controls Britain now, he has no strength to expand in a short period of time. Therefore, it is estimated that the Channel Islands will be controlled by the French for a while. Then let the Count of Calais trust. Marin said after thinking about it. Trusteeship? What does that mean? It means temporarily handing it over to the Earl of Calais for management. Since we can't keep it for now, we can temporarily hand it over to the French. Moreover, the word trusteeship is very flexible. Now that your Majesty is temporarily unable to take it back, just hand it over to the French for control. Wait until your Majesty has gained a firm foothold, then end this trusteeship and take it back. After all, this archipelago is only temporarily trusted by the Earl of Calais, not incorporated into the Earldom of Calais. Legally speaking, the king has the right to take it back. From the perspective of the French, they probably think that you are just playing a word game by saying you are embarrassed to cede it directly. But in fact, when England becomes stable and strong again, you can take back the trusteeship. Marin came from the future and had seen a lot of word games. This kind of trick came up casually. Edward's eyes lit up immediately and said, "This is good, it's settled." When the French envoy heard about Edward's plan, he was stunned. "Your Majesty, you are right, aren't you? The Calais fortress has been occupied by our Kingdom of France. What do you mean by giving it to Francois?" Edward said seriously. "That's what I mean. I don't want to be a king who cedes territory and humiliates my country. Therefore, I hope to hand over the Calais region to the French through this disguised means. Francois is a French officer anyway. He became a count, and the county of Calais has autonomy. Isn't it the same as giving it to France? Moreover, the Channel Islands are also included." The French envoy suddenly realized, it turned out that they were embarrassed to directly say that they would cede territory. What a city maniac. But isn't the Calais region and a small Channel Islands too little? The French envoy felt that it was not enough. In addition to the Calais region that the French army had already occupied, they only gave a small archipelago. Are they sending away beggars? Mr. Envoy, I am also very sad about the loss of the French army this time. However, according to the original agreement, the French army should cooperate with our army to conquer the southern part of England and help capture London before I can give you the home county. However, the French army failed and did not complete the task of cooperating with our army in the battle. Therefore, your country did not fulfill the agreement. According to the agreement, I can't give you more territory. The Calais area and the Channel Islands are actually the rewards for these 7,000 French soldiers. The French envoy was speechless for a moment. Yes, the French army did not fulfill the agreement, and it was okay for them not to pay. And, most importantly, the French navy was completely wiped out this time, and they didn't even have the ability to arm to demand wages. Even if they wanted to use these 7,000 French troops to threaten Edward, they couldn't do it. Didn't they see Marin's 20,000 troops around? In desperation, the French envoy had to return with 7,000 troops first. Before returning, Edward held a simple ceremony to confer the title of Count of Calais to François, a French knight who commanded 7,000 French troops, and gave him the trusteeship of the Channel Islands. In this way, Edward did not sell out any interests of England on the surface. The French, on the other hand, only got a small Channel Islands this time, with a total area of more than 100 square kilometers. And considering the huge losses in the Channel War, the French lost a lot this time. Alas, I gave the Calais fortress to the French in person. Edward sighed unwillingly. No, the Calais fortress has long been lost. It was lost during the reign of Henry VII. You have done a good job in keeping the Calais area from being lost on the surface. Marin persuaded. He was not optimistic about whether the British could recapture the Calais fortress. You know, although the French navy is scum, it is very strong on land. If the Calais fortress had not fallen, it would be easy to say. Now, it has entered the mouth of the French, and it is almost impossible to get it out. Since I can't get it back, losing it in such a decent way is also a good way to save face in desperation. Chapter 690, Destroy the Scottish Army First. François, the French knight who was canonized as the Count of Calais, felt like a pie in the sky fell when he was hungry. He was ecstatic. Although he knew that King Louis XII of France would never let him manage a strategic location like the Calais fortress, François understood that in exchange, Louis XII would definitely give him a generous reward. At the very least, this treatment was much better than the treatment of his previous knighthood. More importantly, with the title of Count of Calais, his eldest son would no longer have to exchange his life for the status of a knight, the lowest level of nobility that could only be enjoyed for one lifetime and could not be inherited, like himself. Even if there are no benefits like ordinary earls, as long as both Britain and France recognize his earldom, his descendants will be able to inherit this title without paying any price and become aristocrats for generations. That feeling made Knight François so excited that he couldn't speak. Don't forget to come to London when I officially ascend the throne in London. At that time, I will hold a formal ceremony for you to be crowned as Earl, don't forget. Edward instructed before boarding the ship. Yes, 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 I will be on time. François, dizzy, boarded the ship back home with floating steps. Looking at the sailing ship in the distance, Marin suddenly smacked his lips. What a pity, I originally planned to use glue to glue a boat to drown these French officers. Now, there is no chance. What a pity. Then, he said to Edward. Your Majesty, it seems that you can't use that glue boat. Edward was silent for a while, and suddenly said. No, it can be used. Still useful. For whom? Marin was very curious. Anyway, it's not for me. After all, I built this ship myself, and I can't ride it. Have you forgotten the children of my cousins? You mean, the children of His Majesty Edward IV's daughters? Marin suddenly realized. Edward IV had quite a lot of children. In addition to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, who were killed by Richard III, there were 5 daughters alive. In addition to Princess Elizabeth, the Queen of Henry VII, and the little Princess Bridget who became a nun, there were 3 other princesses, Cecily of York, Anne of York and Catherine of York. These 3 princesses were married and had children, and they all had children. Legally speaking, their children all had the right to inherit the throne, and they ranked very high. Edward could execute the children of Queen Elizabeth in the name of the illegitimate offspring of the regicide Henry VII. However, it was not easy to do with the children of the other 3 princesses. At least, there is no excuse to kill them. Even if Edward, the husband of the 3 women, can find an excuse to kill them by, following the rebellion, the children of the 3 cousins are royal blood, so it is not easy to kill them. But Edward is unwilling to leave them. How did the War of the Roses come about? Wasn't it because the children of the royal branches, supported by some people, rose up to fight for the throne? The children of Edward's 3 cousins are all the blood of the York royal family. If they are supported by an ambitious person, they will immediately become competitors for the throne. Therefore, Edward thought about it, in order to avoid the reappearance of the War of the Roses, and to learn from the practice of his mortal enemy Henry VII, he decided to cut the grass and root out the future troubles of the royal family. However, it is easy to be accused of killing these royal blood directly, and even find an excuse to overthrow them. What's more, the children of those cousins are still children now. So, Edward needs a way to get rid of them without being infamous. Coincidentally, the glue-bonded boat made by Marin meets this requirement. Edward could hypocritically allow his cousin's children to go into exile abroad by boat. Under everyone's witness, these royal bloodlines would be sent to the luxurious ships and sail out of London. Then, under the impact of the wind and waves of the English Channel, the ship fell apart, and the children drowned in the middle of the English Channel. In this way, Edward would not have to bear the infamy of slaughtering his relatives. Marin thought about it and felt that Edward's plan was very good. Send the children on board under the witness of everyone to get rid of suspicion. Then if the ship has an accident at sea, don't blame me. However, after thinking about it, Marin reminded. Your Majesty, don't forget one person. Who? Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter of the false King Henry. She is the Queen of Scotland. This is indeed difficult. Edward suddenly remembered that Margaret Tudor had married King James IV of Scotland in 1503. Although James IV was dissatisfied with the small dowry given by Henry VII. But it is undeniable that Margaret Tudor is the eldest daughter of Henry VII. Once Edward captured London, killed Henry VII and his son Henry VIII, as well as his youngest daughter Mary, the future Queen of France. Louis XII died in her belly. Queen Margaret Tudor of Scotland would immediately become the only legitimate heir to Henry VII's Tudor dynasty. Moreover, Marin and Edward could be sure that with James IV's character and the French's unwillingness to see England doing well, they would definitely support Margaret Tudor as the heir to the throne of England. Even if they did not support Margaret Tudor as the Queen of England, they would support her son as the King of England. This was the national policy of the French and the Scots, to make England restless for a day. We will have to attack Scotland later and get rid of Margaret. Edward frowned. Scotland is not easy to mess with, their army is still there, tens of thousands of troops. Moreover, Scotland is difficult to attack due to its rugged terrain. Yes. The Scottish army has entered England. Let's defeat it. Edward slapped his thigh and said. Defeat who? Marin did not react for a while. Scotland's 10,000 troops. As long as these 10,000 people are eliminated, Scotland with only a few 100,000 people will definitely not be able to recover. After we deal with Henry, Scotland without an army will have a difficult terrain. Will it not let us beat it? We will rush into Edinburgh and kill Margaret Tudor. Marin said helplessly. Your Majesty, our agreement does not include the elimination of Scotland. If so, I will increase the price. No problem, I'll give you another Scottish county, close to Northumberland, so that your territory can be doubled. Okay, deal. Then, Marin's army immediately turned north to eliminate the Scottish army. Damn. It was just a few seconds, and it was past 12 o'clock, so it was the 24th. My perfect attendance award. I'm going to cry in the toilet.